King of America has always been an idea of fantasy, but it was once a little more than that. While many have called the United States and its governance a grand experiment, grand often emphasized and experiment often ignored, upon embarking upon the experiment of Republican government, the Founding Fathers were notoriously cynical. When asked, "Well, doctor, what have we got, a republic or a monarchy?" Benjamin Franklin really did respond, "A republic, if you can keep it," at least according to the notes of Dr. James McHenry of Maryland. Alexander Hamilton regularly pointed to the republics of Greece and Italy as a warning about the failures of republican government. States, he wrote, kept in a state of perpetual vibration between the extremes of tyranny and anarchy. John Adams outright believed any form of democracy was doomed to degenerate into dictatorship, or, as he put it in more colorful terms, commit suicide. The eventual success of the American government after 1776 and 1789 was more or less unexpected. Suppose, though, in another world, Franklin had answered, "A monarchy, and so it shall be." Could it have happened? Yes, it could have, but the chances were always slim. It is incorrect to state the American founders never entertained the idea of monarchy in America. The concept of a strong central figure to unite a new, disordered nation around it had its appeal. Beside republics like the Netherlands and Venice, for however democratic they were for the time, monarchy was the norm among nations in the 1700s. Among the founders, monarchy was always a somewhat fringe opinion. Though no more kings is often overemphasized today, the American people did have a lingering distaste for monarchs. The danger of encroaching autocracy only appealed to the most reactionary among them. This hypothetical monarchy would have likely been constitutional and based off the English model, but an American throne would have offered a strong guiding hand. During the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787, when local newspapers printed a rumor that the secretive convention planned to invite a European monarch to rule the states, a riot nearly broke out. The strange thing? Those reports were true. Technically, kind of. Fears of military dictatorship during the Revolution would give birth to the notorious Prussian Scheme, a bizarre conspiracy theory that turned out to be tangentially true, and it was only discovered in passing more than a century later. Historical bias makes monarchy seem a foreign concept to the United States. This is not necessarily true, though. During the founding of the United States, nearly every form of classical government, those based on the models of Greece and Rome, were entertained and weighted to some regards. Of them all, a republic or monarchy seemed the most in line with Enlightenment values. Re-embracing monarchy, though, was a non-starter to the influential landowners and intellectuals of the Revolution. The appeal of it did not die out, though. The American Revolution and early Republic were chaotic. The Articles of Confederation, which united the states post-independence from 1777 to 1789 in bonds of perpetual friendship, were as weak as they sound. The Articles provided only a weak central government, which failed at its purpose of collecting taxes and protecting the states. The President of the Congress, for example, referred to as President of the United States in Congress assembled, essentially had no power besides ceremonially signing things. Among other issues, the Congress only succeeded in the basics of foreign diplomacy. A series of former revolts across the states made it seem like this confederation and its Continental Congress would soon dissolve into anarchy. Only the drafting of the Constitution in 1787 would start to remedy these inherent problems, though it would have plenty of growing pains. Seeing these failures, some had some rose-tinted nostalgia for the king. It was rumored the most hardline conservatives of Massachusetts still maintained sympathy for monarchy by 1800. Many conceived the only way to answer for the Confederation and early republic's lack of centralization was strong central rule by a single figure. Most of these arguments boiled down to pure pragmatism. Very few were committed to any spiritual virtue of monarchy in itself. As the lawyer William Plumer, governor of New Hampshire from 1812 to 1813, wrote about the biting realism of the Revolution in 1784, I am fully resolved to use my power and influence in supporting that form of government which my country establishes. I do not feel hostile to either democracy, autocracy, or monarchy. I am inclined to think the people are much more interested in the good administration than in the theory or form of the government. Or, as Alexander Pope expresses it, that government is best which is administered best. Plumer's letter raises a few eyebrows today. Autocracy? Remember, the founders found inspiration in ancient Rome's republic and dictators. For the time, elements of autocracy were not foreign things in the contemporary republics. The only other successful, at the time, republic to look towards for inspiration was the Dutch Republic, and its States General. Each province of the United Province could assign a stadtholder, who, theoretically, held absolute authority in one province or more. The United States, though, had the issue of size compared to the tiny Dutch Republic. In hopes of a solution, Alexander Hamilton briefly revived the concept of an anglicized stateholder from stadtholder, or the President General, a government that had been proposed by the Albany Plan of Union during English rule to unite the colonies under a centralized government. Hamilton's stateholder aligned with Federalist views on a strong central government. This stateholder was a sort of elected civil official that ruled for a life term. The stateholder could only be removed from office by impeachment or death, making the role more akin to a dictator in the Roman sense than how we understand the presidency today. But the stadtholder held no military power. Hamilton himself had based the concept off the English Constitution, without the monarchist trappings, which he referred to as a model for the most perfect government. The problem? Hamilton's stateholder was essentially just elective monarchy without dynastic politics. The concept of monarchy, absolute ruler or not, was the last thing on the minds of the citizens of the United States after the Revolution. General opinion perceived anything like a monarchy as an expensive drain on an already debt-burdened nation post-independence. A navy to protect the nation and trade was the more pressing issue. The demand for a king would not come from the common people of America. The concept of an American monarchy was purely the fantasy of certain fringe elite who rarely expressed the opinion. Even Hamilton, one of the more sympathetic to the idea among the major founders, admitted that the mind of the average American was so thoroughly Republican that an idea of imposing monarchy on them was an idle dream. Kings did have their purpose on the global stage, though. The shadow of autocracy always lingered close to the United States during its early days. During the Revolution, the American rebels feared they would not be taken seriously by European monarchs and officials. They were lawyers and landowners going to war with nobles and court officials. The alliance with France gave the insurgent American nation much-needed legitimacy against Britain. Even then, the Continental Army feared, even with Washington's command, they lacked the brass necessary to deal with Great Britain. A solution was briefly entertained: appoint the French Marshal Victor Francois, 2nd Duc de Broglie, as Supreme Commander of the American Armed Forces. The 2nd Duc de Broglie is a somewhat forgotten figure today, but he was a notorious French noble in his time, famous for both able command and ambition. Supposedly, the Duke had once attempted to become the King of Poland before he was disgraced before the French court. He was only restored in 1778 to lead French forces in America. The idea of appointing the Marshal Supreme Commander had its appeal. It would support the Franco-American alliance and unite the war under a centralized commander. Among the troops, there was a demand for a sort of strongman generalissimo to lead the war. As shown by the many supposed conspiracies that sought to appoint George Washington king, or similar fears of conspiracy that stoked rumors French troops would mutiny and appoint the Duke Generalissimo. By the last days of the war, the plan being drafted was to offer Victor Francois the role of Supreme Commander for a term of 3 years with some civil authority. Then the war was over before anything happened. The 2nd Duc de Broglie returned to Europe with no issue. This plan never left the drawing board after all. It was only a draft at best, and may have never been seriously considered at all. The fears of a French dictatorship in America were real enough to upset some, though. As John Adams reflected on the affair, "I will not put on the chains of France when I am struggling to throw off those of Great Britain." Victor Francois would go on to oppose the French Revolution, though, commanding the army of princes in Europe after 1792, which sought to overthrow the French Revolution and restore the House of Bourbon to the French throne. so who knows what could have happened. The proliferation of every negative rumor by the press led only to inflame public panic about the restoration of monarchy in the United States. There was intense suspicion in 1787 when many figures convened in Philadelphia for the Great Convention to reform the Articles of Confederation. Provoked by public fears, the Fairfield Gazette reported on July 15, 1789, that the convention planned to invite Prince Frederic, Duke of Albany and York, and then Prince Bishop of Osbruck, at the time, to rule a united empire of the United States and Canada. The article reported the plan had been hatched in Connecticut. But the letter raised enough worry for Alexander Hamilton to write a letter to Jeremiah Wadsworth in Connecticut, telling him to investigate the origins of the rumor. Wadsworth, a sea captain and merchant, reported the rumor had originally been printed in New Haven as a scare tactic against radical anti-federalists who opposed the Constitutional Convention. The plot to invite the prince to rule America was nothing but hot air. Another, more extreme rumor would circulate soon after, the half-legendary Prussian Scheme. Newspapers were soon printing anonymous statements and theories that a faction of radical monarchists and the continental/confederational government planned to invite a Prussian prince to rule the United States. Soon people feared radical elements would seize control. The Prussian Scheme may seem bizarre to Americans today, inviting a German prince to rule America, but it had legs at the time. George I of Great Britain had, after all, been born in Hanover, a German prince who cared little for the English language. He had ascended to the English throne barely 70 years before. Inviting a Prussian to rule America was not absolute fantasy. The American founders had a great admiration of Prussia and its then monarch Frederick the Great. Frederick was perceived across the United States as the enlightened warrior scholar king who all monarchs should strive to imitate. Had Frederick been invited to become the symbolic king of the United States, there may have very well been support for the idea had it been proposed. The problem, Frederick was apathetic towards the United States. Not that he hated America, Frederick was just too absorbed in the affairs of Europe at the time. He just hated England. Frederick's hatred for the English mainly stemmed from Great Britain's meddling on the continent and their control over the electorate of Hanover in Germany. The revolution across the sea was a welcome surprise. Frederick's problem was he did not want to directly attack England. He was smart enough to not directly challenge them. Prussia would not be able to win against Great Britain's naval dominance. He instead decided to hamstring Britain by tacitly supporting the United States. He stopped German mercenaries, such as the Hessians, from traveling through Prussia and Berlin to join Britain during the Revolution. He also impeded the movement of English troops across Europe. American ships, too, were allowed unofficial safety in Prussian harbors. The Americans took this as a sign of friendship, but it was all business to Frederick. As he explained his England policy, we ought not in sport to rise up foes. Since Frederick was dedicated to Prussia, a supposed faction in the American government sought to invite the second-best candidate, Frederick's brother, Prince Henry of Prussia, an unlanded prince with ambitions. Henry had attempted to become the King of Poland during the First Partition of Poland in 1772, then offered himself as a possibility for the King of Wallachia to Russia. His older brother Frederick put a stop to both of those attempts. Being the Hofmarschall of Prussia, basically a chancellor, Prince Henry was a promising candidate despite entering his 60s by this point. This was the birth of the Prussian Scheme. According to legend, this shadowy conspiracy used General Friedrich William von Steuben as a go-between. Von Steuben was a Prussian general, formerly in service of the Prussian court where he was a friend of Prince Henry, who had been employed by the Americans during the War of Independence, and simply stayed in the nation afterwards. Steuben's secretary, John W. Mulligan, related, after Steuben's death, an anecdote that may have been about this Prussian scheme, or it may have been a drunken joke, as one of the party, addressing himself to Steuben, asked whether Prince Henry of Prussia would be willing to accept an invitation and whether he would make a good president. Steuben answered, "As far as I know, the prince, he would never think of crossing the ocean to be your master. I wrote to him a good while ago what kind of fellows you are. He would not have the patience to stay 3 days among you." For decades afterwards, Mulligan's story was discounted as misconstrued gossip. Despite the lack of hard evidence, the Prussian scheme had durability. Some did believe there was a conspiracy to offer Prince Henry supreme command of the American armies in 1777-1778, suggesting the story had mixed with that of the feared French dictatorship. President James Monroe had even told General Andrew Jackson that he, as president, believed several radical Federalists had been in favor of monarchy before 1800, though accusations of such sympathies were a common smear in the early American Republic. In 1825, Senator Rufus King remarked in the Senate about a proposal to invite a German prince to the intended American throne, a statement which triggered an official investigation by President John Quincy Adams, but nothing was ever proven or even found. Then around 1910, an unsent letter by Henry was found in the Prussian archives. Written in French, as Henry often did to international audiences, the letter was addressed to von Steuben. It is undated, but by political references, it seems to imply a period between 1786-1788. The language is vague, meant to be indecipherable to prying eyes, but it is suggestive, implying von Steuben is offering Henry some position in the USA. In the end, Henry rejects von Steuben's vague offer and instead insinuates the United States would fare better with France, perhaps alluding to a French candidate for the non-existent American throne, or whatever Steuben was offering to Henry. What makes the letter more interesting is Henry references another previous letter from the United States, which was not from von Steuben, but was about a similar issue. What other American official could have written a Prussian prince? While Prince Henry offers little beside political observations in the letter, the legends of the Prussian scheme do implicate the figure who could have sent the first letter. Nathaniel Gorham of Massachusetts was the president of the Continental Congress, signer of the Constitution, but is now largely forgotten in modern American history. Gorham's obscurity is likely due to the fact he kept few records. Unlike most of the other founders, there are no Gorham papers, and his preserved letters are few in number. This makes him a common target for theories declaring him the mastermind behind several conspiracies of silence, plans translated only verbally, that circulated after the American Revolution. It's doubtful Gorham was a radical monarchist, though. As president of the Continental Congress, he was writing to Prince Henry in the national interest of order. As stated earlier, before the Constitutional Convention, the United States seemed on the verge of eventual collapse. Gorham was not committing treachery because, well, the Constitution which cemented the American government did not exist yet anyways. While we do not have the date of Gorham's hypothetical letter, it can be assumed he was writing at a point when anything seemed possible in the future. If Gorham did write Prince Henry, he was only doing so out of desperation because he feared a breakdown into total anarchy. While the correspondence between Gorham and Prince Henry, if it exists at all, has never been found, Gorham's letter is probably destroyed and Henry's undiscovered. Folklore, from a note by Rufus King, alleges that Prince Henry had declined by informing Mr. Gorham that the Americans had shown so much determination about their old king that they would not readily submit to a new one. Another piece that collaborates the stories. While the von Steuben letter is not confirmation the Prussian scheme was real, it suggests there was something, if only as a backup plan, in the background. Americans, after all, do not readily submit. If there was any sympathy to monarchy in the early American Republic, it was not strong enough to become an actual political force. Instead, all that remains are poorly substantiated rumors of shadowy conspiracies that circulated in the news press. The native birth clause of the presidency may have even been added to prevent the inviting of a foreign monarch to rule America. This Prussian scheme may have pushed the United States towards a republic more than it supported a future monarchy. As John Quincy Adams wrote about the whole affair to Charles King, son of Rufus King, in a letter, that henceforth Prince Henry of Prussia will be suffered to sleep in peace. For my conspiracy of support, I'm going to give a thank you to The Single Way Out and the Gel Samini family.